In their first ever game, Hans Niemann sacrificed the knight against Magnus Carlsen, but what happened next will shock you even more than the Grinch running away from his tiny exploding car. Okay, in the game, Magnus Carlsen opens 1e4 best by test, and both players head straight for the Ruy Lopez variation of the open games with the move Bishop b5. And of course, this game took place in the 2022 Charity Cup prelims. Now from here, Hans Niemann has a big surprise waiting for Magnus, and he heads straight for the open variation of the Ruy Lopez with the move Knight takes e4. Now this move here is the start of a very forced sequence of moves. Here, white goes d4, that is the strongest idea. If instead white goes rook to e1, simply trying to attack the knight. Then black goes knight to c5, and this move nearly equalizes on the spot. So instead of that, here d4 played in the game by Magnus. Now Hans b5, bishop b3, and here Hans plays the best move d5, simply bolstering the knight on the e4 square. Of course, if Hans were to go e takes d4 here, then rook e1 is very, very dangerous. That knight is not looking good on the open e-file. Now back to the game with the move d5 from Hans. Here Magnus once again has a choice. Knight takes e5 is a little bit weaker. Here's why. If you go knight takes e5, black responds knight takes, d takes, that is c6. And here with one pair of knights off the board, this position is very, very fine for black. So instead, the move is d takes e5. You get the space advantage and keep all of the minor pieces on the board for now. And this is the real starting point of the open Spanish. Here, black goes bishop to e6, simply bolstering the pawn on the d5 square. Of course, it was being threatened by the bishop and the queen. And now from here, Magnus Carlsen is a very big choice. So what are his options? Lately, he's been loving the idea of queen to e2 and rook to d1. However, in the game, he goes for the old main line. That is where you go c3, knight to d2, and bishop c2. And your bishop and your knight put pressure on black's knight on e4. So with that in mind, c3 by Magnus. Now here, the main line for black starts with bishop to e7. There are some very, very long lines here. For example, the main line, white goes knight d2, black goes knight c5, bishop c2, and then d4. A lot of theory here. Instead of all this, though, Hans Niemann, he busts out the move bishop c5, and this move is connected with a very specific sacrifice on the f2 square. So now here, Magnus, knight d2, again continuing the plan, bishop c2 next, putting pressure on e4. Now black castles, bishop c2, and here Hans Niemann busts out his big idea. He sacks the knight on the f2 square, knight takes f2 on the board. Here we go. Okay, what is the idea? Well, it's simple. Black is going to trade the knight and the bishop for the pawn and rook from white. So for example, rook takes, bishop takes, king takes, and finally, here Hans Niemann starts the attack against the white king with the move f6. His goal is very simple. He wants to recapture on e5, gaining control of the center and blowing open the f-file with the king. Now real fast, I want to show why this move f6 from Hans is so important. The other main idea might be bishop g4. Of course, the bishop is pinning the knight to the queen on d1. However, here, this gives white plenty of time to tuck his king away on the g1 square, and even if black recaptures on e5, the knight cannot recapture because of the pin, but here after queen to f1, white has a very, very large advantage. So with that in mind, the move f6 from black is absolutely necessary in this position here. Now from here, what the heck is white supposed to do? Well, first things first, you got to get that king to safety. Magnus does that with the move king to g1, getting it off the open f-file, very good. And after this, Magnus Carlsen is likely going to go knight to f1, perhaps knight to e3, or bishop e3 next, depending on what Hans Niemann does in the game. Now here, Hans, he has a choice. Does he want to recapture on the e5 square with the f-pawn or with the knight? Well, it turns out knight takes e5 is not a good move here. First of all, you need all of those pieces on the board to start the attack, but beyond that, here, white can simply recapture on e5, then go queen to h5, and this queen is a menace in white's position, currently attacking e5. White also has pressure on the h7 square. I mean, how is black going to defend everything here? So with that being said, instead of knight takes e5, the move f takes e5 was played by Hans in the game, and this completes phase 1 of his strategy. He now has those pawns on the d5 and e5 squares and decent attacking chances against the white king here. Now beyond this, Hans Niemann is planning at some point the moves e4 and then knight to e5. This allows him to bring his last remaining piece, that knight on the c6 square, into the attack. Now from here, of course, Magnus Carlsen has some things to say about it. He continues his basic plan, knight to f1. From now, both the knight and the bishop eye the e3 square. Magnus simply trying to get all of his pieces into the game as fast as he possibly can. Now, real fast, if Magnus did not find knight to f1, then he's going to have a very tough position. For example, the next best move is going to be queen to e1, putting pressure on that e5 pawn. However, here Hans has a very forced sequence to a good game. The first move is bishop to f5. Remember, Hans Niemann, he is planning e4 at some point, at which point this becomes a quote-unquote bad bishop. So with that in mind, bishop f5, trying to trade it off is a great idea. Now here, white has to go bishop b3, try to keep the bishop alive, putting pressure on this diagonal here. But once again, Hans Niemann has an idea. e4, knight d4, then knight takes, and then finally the move a5, try to get counterplay against that bishop on the b3 square. And here Hans Niemann once again has a perfectly fine position. So with that in mind, knight f1 is pretty much the only idea, putting pressure on black. Knight f1 in the game. And here once again, Hans Niemann has a very, very big choice. Here the two big options are going to be getting the queen into the game on either the d7 or the d6 squares, or if not that, then you may want to go bishop g4, putting pressure on that knight, and of course threatening the move e4, hitting the knight that is pinned to the queen. Now with that being said, what is the right move here? Well, let's start with bishop g4. If black does this here, then after knight to e3, of course the bishop has to go somewhere. And the computer seems to think simply retreating the bishop back to e6 is playable, but this move is too much, even for Hans Niemann. I have no idea why the computer recommends this. So overall, bishop g4, not a fan of that move at all. Instead, the two main moves are queen to d7 and queen d6. They're both very playable. In the game, Hans Niemann goes queen d6. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen, what does he do? Well, the next main problem for him is going to be, how do I get that bishop on c1 into the game? So with that in mind, the two most logical squares are going to be bishop e3 and bishop g5. But which one is better? Now, technically, the bishop does look a little bit more active on the g5 square. After all, you still have the e3 square available for the knight, and the bishop does look to be doing something on this diagonal here. However, there is a big problem with the move bishop g5. But first, here's why bishop b3 is the better move. Here, bishop b3, now the main line goes e4. This is the main idea for black. And now after knight to e4, the bishop does a fantastic job of controlling the d4 square. So, for example, if black jumps in with the knight to e5, then Magnus would have the idea knight takes e6, then after queen takes bishop d4, again showing the key placement of the bishop on e3, having easy access to the d4 square. Now let's go back to the other line with bishop g5 and see why g5 is not the right square for the bishop. Alright, here Magnus bishop g5, now Hans e4, knight d4, and knight to e5. Okay, what's the problem here? Well, if white tries to go bishop to e3, this is a massive mistake in this position because black has the resource knight to g4. Oh boy, this is a huge problem for black. For example, here, if you go queen e2 trying to defend, then there's this beautiful forced combination from black. First, you take the knight on the f1 square with the rook. Rook takes f1. And now, very importantly, if white takes back with the rook, the most logical move, then you literally get checkmated in one move. Queen takes h2. Of course, the knight on f1 was defending h2. That is no longer the case. That is game over. So with that in mind, you have to recapture with the king. Of course, if you take it with the queen, then e3 falls. So king takes f1, rook f8, king e1, and then knight takes h2. This is an absolute disaster for white. So, of course, bishop e3, not a good move in this position. All right, with that being said, if you really do want that bishop on the d4 square, here you can still technically do it. First, you got to take that bishop on the e6 square. Knight takes, then queen takes, then bishop e3. However, of course, here, white did waste tempo going bishop g5, then bishop e3, and here black has a perfectly fine game, even if white gets that bishop on the d4 square, and after a5, black is doing just fine here. Okay, knight takes e6. Clearly not the move. What is white going to do then? Well, in the game, Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the knight to the e3 square. Now, this is the one advantage of having that bishop on g5 instead of on e3. Of course, now e3 is still available for the knight. All right, now Hans Niemann, bishop d7 is his move. The best idea, that bishop was being attacked, simply retreating it. Very good idea, keeping that bishop alive. And of course, if Hans Niemann were to get the move c5, kicking the knight away from d4, and then the move d4 on the board, that bishop bishop might have a very bright future on c6 on this long diagonal. So once again, that bishop a very important piece here. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he shows why he's truly the GOAT. He finds a marvelous move. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to solve this puzzle. Not a combination, but it is a beautiful move. The move here, bishop h4, wonderful stuff. His idea is very simple. He wants to go bishop g3, simply pinning that knight on e5 to the queen on the d6 square. Very good stuff, and keep in mind, that is pretty much the only move that keeps the game level here for Magnus. Of course, other moves like b4 simply doesn't cut it. Here after a5, Hans Niemann has tons of counterplay all over the board. So now, bishop h4 in the game, and here Hans Niemann, very critical position. What is he supposed to do? Well, once again, good time for a puzzle, as this is probably the critical position in the game for Hans Niemann. Try to solve this one for Hans. Did you find it? All right, here we go. The key move for Hans here is the move c5, and yes, this is a very thematic idea. You're trying to kick the knight away from the d4 square and then go d4 yourself with those pawns on d4 and e4. Now here, white has two main ideas. One is you retreat the knight to b3. The other is you actually ignore the threat against the knight. You give back the piece and go bishop b3. All right, the easier one first, knight to b3. What happens here? Well, then black actually jumps in with the knight to the d3 square, and here, believe it or not, white cannot take it twice on d3. So for example, bishop takes, e takes, and now queen takes d3 is simply suicide, because after queen takes d3, black has the resource c4, forking both the knight and the queen. So overall, that's no good, and after knight to d3, black's gonna have a great game with that super powerful knight on the d3 square. Now instead, what about that other move, bishop b3? This move is very sexy. The idea is you give up the knight on the d4 square, and in exchange, you take on d5 with tempo against the king and the rook on the a8 square. So for example here, bishop e6, bishop takes a8, rook takes a8, and black here, despite being down a pawn, he has a very good game in this position thanks to his very well centralized pieces here. Now unfortunately for Hans, he did not find this move c5. Instead, he swings over with the queen all the way to the h6 square. What's the idea here? Well, it's very simple. Hans is putting pressure on the bishop and the knight on the e3 square. So not a bad idea at first sight. However, there is a big problem with it. So here, Magnus, what should he do? Well, it turns out any move by the bishop is simply bad. For example, bishop g3, try to retreat, you lose the knight. That is no good. What about bishop f2? How does that one work out? Well, this move is simply too slow. Here after rook a to e8, black is piling up all of the pieces in the center and on the king side, and white is going to be in a lot of trouble here. So with that being said, Magnus, once again, being the GOAT, he finds the best idea by far. That is, you jump in with the knight to the f5 square, knight d to f5, and by the way, knight e to f5, also very playable, very similar looking ideas. Now, knight d f5 in the game. Here, Hans Niemann chops off that knight. Bishop takes, knight takes. Now here, the queen on h6 is being attacked. What is Hans Niemann supposed to do? Well, he is in a pickle. There is simply no easy solution. For example, if black makes the mistake of taking the knight on the f5 square, then white wins on the spot with the very powerful move queen takes d5, and suddenly both the king and the rook on a8 are being forked. That is effectively game over. Okay, heading back, if that is not the right move, rook takes f5 does not work. If that's the case, what the heck is black supposed to do here? Well, in the game, Hans Niemann finds the only move that gives him a fighting chance. That is knight to f3 check. Oh my goodness, what is the idea behind this move? Well, first of all, you are checking the king, and what if white simply takes the knight? Well, then you go rook takes f5, and because the knight is not on e5, the rook has unrestricted access to defend the d5 square, stopping queen takes d5, forking the rook and the king. Oh, brilliant stuff. And by the way, here, if the king simply moves out of the way of the check, then once again, rook takes f5, and here, yes, the knight on f3 is hanging, but so is the bishop on h4. Here, Hans Niemann is simply winning. All right, those two moves do not work. Hans Niemann being especially tricky in this game. Magnus Carlsen, what do you do here? Well, this is Magnus freaking Carlsen we're talking about. He finds the idea for white, queen takes f3. This looks insane, and no, it's not a queen sacrifice because here Hans Niemann's queen is also being attacked. Okay, what the heck is Hans Niemann supposed to do here? Well, he has a few options, none of them are enviable. For example, queen takes h4 is an option. The idea is after knight takes, you simply win back the queen on the f3 square. However, here white simply recaptures with the knight, and this is going to be a very, very difficult endgame. Those two minor pieces are simply stronger than the rook and the extra pawn for black. Now, rewinding, what else can black do? Well, here e takes f3 is an option. Then after knight takes, g takes, then finally g takes f3. Once again, we have a very difficult endgame. White having those two bishops versus the rook, and this is going to be a very, very tough position to hold for Hans Niemann. So with that in mind, Hans Niemann avoids both of these endgames, instead playing queen to b6. Boom, giving the king a little shack on the g1 square. Now here Magnus, how does he respond? Well, queen to e3, once again offering that queen trade if the queens fall. And Magnus is going to have a very, very good endgame with those two bishops as we saw on the other lines. And here Hans Niemann, he sees nothing better than to go for the endgame. For example, here, if you go queen takes e3, then after knight takes, here white simply dominating. So instead of that, here the move is actually rook takes f5, begging white to take on the b6 square, and that is what happens in the game. Queen takes, then c takes, and here finally the attack fizzles out. We have an endgame, but it's not a symmetrical one. It's very, very interesting. Magnus Carlsen here has those two bishops, and as we're going to see, he's going to give a masterclass in how to simply dominate the one rook from Hans Niemann. All right, here Magnus, he starts bishop f2, targeting that weak pawn on the b6 square. Black is forced to go rook b8 defending, but now rook d1, once again activating the rook targeting d5. The threat is bishop b3. Next, with that in mind, the king must come in to the center right away. That's what happens. King f7, bishop b3, king e6, and now it looks like Hans Niemann is defending. However, in this position, Magnus once again finds the key idea. Rook to d4. The threat now is rook takes e4, and the pawn on the d5 square is pinned by the bishop. Oh boy, here Hans sees nothing better than retreating with the king, but now rook takes d5, and suddenly Hans Niemann has a terrible endgame. What's he gonna do? He tries sacking a pawn on b4, but Magnus simply takes it. He's a simple man. He sees a free pawn, he takes it. What is Hans gonna do here? Rook c8, trying to activate the rook, then once again another pawn falls. Rook c1, king f2, then rook c2, king g3. Finally Hans wins one pawn, but it's not enough. Magnus takes on e4, and he simply defends the pawn permanently on the b4 square. Here Hans Niemann, he's gonna lose these pawns on the king side, and with that in mind, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game. Hans Niemann busting out a crazy idea in the open Sicilian with the move knight takes f2, getting a rook and a pawn in exchange for those two minor pieces. Plus, you can't forget Hans Niemann's attack. But in the end, Magnus Carlsen's defense was simply too much. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I'll see you in the next video.